Today, we are talking about this brief article entitled The Logical Mistake of Racism by this dubious sounding character named Joseph W. Long. And if that name sounds familiar to you, that's because it's me, your instructor. I published this paper back in 2001, spring of 2001. Wow, that seems crazy. If anyone knows me in philosophy, and no one does, but if they do, it's generally because of this article. This, for a few years, had made it onto a number of syllabi. I've seen a number of YouTube videos out there critiquing this article and trying to make sense of it. Anyway, I would like to talk a little bit about uh, this this paper today in two parts. In the first part, we're going to sort of just go over the broad ideas, and then I would like to um go into more detail in a second video, talking about the naturalistic fallacy specifically. Well, students, I know that you will be writing some papers. You'll be writing many papers in your careers, and so one of the things I would like to point out here is Long's thesis statement here on the first page, the second column there, first full paragraph. Um, in this paper, I will explore and attempt to define one very important type of egregious discrimination: racism. I will argue that racism involves a kind of logical mistake. Specifically, I hope to show that racists commit the naturalistic fallacy. Finally, I will defend my account of racism against two challenges, the most important of which argues that if racism is merely a logical error, then racists are not morally culpable. I want to point out this thesis statement for a couple of reasons. Uh, One, I think this is a pretty good model of a thesis statement as you are writing your papers. And I say that not because the thesis statement is so brilliant, but rather because it is so commonplace. Um, in almost every paper that I've written in the last 25 years, and there's been a lot of them, you can find these five words in this order very early in the paper. Uh, in this paper, I will, or in this chapter, I will, in this thesis, I will, in this dissertation, I will, in this book, I will. And it is my opinion that if you can finish that sentence, you can write a good paper. So I'm happy to talk with you, students, one on one about um, writing and share some tips and tricks with you. My guess is that by this point in your career, you all have you know some of your own rituals and things. But if you would like to talk a little bit about the process of writing and particularly things like forming a thesis statement, then I'm happy. I'm happy anytime to talk with you. But second, this really gets us going in the paper and tells us what in the world is this paper is going to be about. And by the way, I think that's a good thing to do in a philosophy paper. I think some people are concerned about giving away too much at the beginning. There are no surprises left for the end. But, it's not a mystery novel. We don't need a twist ending. We want clarity. So I think it's fine to go ahead and say, uh, here's the conclusion I'm going to reach. And here, in brief, is the argument, how I'm going to get there. In fact, I think that's a really good thing to do. So, starting on the next page, on page 48, long, I like to refer to myself in the third person only when I am looking at my old work. A couple of reasons. One, I think students find it easier somehow to say, I disagree with Long here, rather than I think you're wrong, Professor. And to make it easier for students to disagree, sometimes I'll use the third person there, Long. But also, this was written in 2001. At the time of this recording, that's over 23 years ago. It's hard for me to believe that. But anyway, there may be things in the paper that that Long 2001 believed or asserted that Long 2024 might not. So on page 48 and 49, Long is primarily concerned with what I will call the ontology of race. What is the ontology of race? What is ontology? You might have heard this term when we're talking uh, about metaphysics. Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. Ontology means having to do with existence, and here Long is asking whether race is a natural ontological kind. Do races exist as biological kinds? And I think Long, fortunately, ended up on the right side of history, arguing no, that races, what we call race, um, are social constructions. But you'll notice that it's still a little bit up in the air. At the time that I wrote this, the FDA had just approved its first race specific drug. It was a drug for sickle cell anemia, but it was um, only approved for African Americans, and that was the title that was used, African Americans. So that was very interesting. Also, DNA sequencing was going on for the Human Genome Project, and you see that in the paper. I quote, where we are as of August 2000, that the scientists have not found a gene or set of genes responsible for determining what it is that we regard as race, right? Well, after Long decides that race is not um, a natural ontological kind, the way that, you know, uh, sedimentary rocks and igneous rocks are two different kinds of rocks and, appearing so naturally. Long argues that races are not like that, right? After that, Long attempts to define racism. Um, after quoting some folks much wiser than I, people like Ruth Benedict, Jorge Garcia, excuse me, that's George Garcia. It's spelled with a J, but he pronounces it George. Yeah, I got to meet George one time at a conference. Leonard Harris and others, Lewis Gordon. Um, Long says that, look, what race is certainly something descriptive, but what racism is inherently normative. And it is this normative judgment, as Leonard Harris says, um, it's that which creates and sustains a virulent pessimism in its victims. It's a systematic denial of a population's humanity. It's the degradation and humiliation of a population as a totally abject collective beyond redemption. So, philosophically, logically, let's pick up from here. Race is a social construction, but it's something descriptive. And racism is something inherently normative. So, really, Long suggests that there is a problem um, when racists infer these normative conclusions from merely descriptive premises. Um, Let me read from the bottom of column 1 on page 49. In the previous section, I argued that however race is defined, it must be something purely descriptive. Clearly, though, racism is something that is inherently normative. Lewis Gordon writes, racism is not a mere matter of fact, but instead of value. What racists are up to is not merely pointing out contingent descriptive facts about people and their racial identities. Many non racists may be interested in doing that. Rather, racists are engaged in making normative judgments based solely on race, which I have already argued is merely a descriptive difference. This sort of reasoning, from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion, or vice versa, is what G.E. Moore labeled in the Principia Ethica the naturalistic fallacy. This logical error occurs whenever someone attempts to infer or deduce a normative or value laden proposition. We might call this an ought statement. From a set of merely descriptive facts or propositions. We might call these is statements. And this is clearly what the racist does. Racists infer normative conclusions about the quality of a person or persons, from merely descriptive premises. That is, for instance, their membership in some race or races. Herein lies the logical mistake of racism. Racists commit the naturalistic fallacy. Long goes on to consider a couple of objections, and I'll talk about these objections briefly. And then in the next video, I want to go into more depth about the naturalistic fallacy. So, a couple of objections. First, an objector might respond, well, what about stereotyping? Is this really a normative exercise? People say to say of a particular racial group that its members are lazy or promiscuous or violent is not the same as to say that they are good or bad, superior or inferior. I think that's crazy, of course. I respond by saying such hurtful stereotypes are, of course, intrinsically normative. They are laden with certain evaluative judgments. Further, such claims can be validly inferred only if these attributes are elemental of a racial group's biology or some other way necessary to that group, but there's no evidence to suggest that. So let's consider another objection, and this is the one that I think is the more stubborn, the more obdurate objection. The top of page 50. Another more serious objector might challenge that since I have reduced racism to a logical mistake, I therefore cannot morally censure racists. They're not morally responsible, the objector might offer, because all they are guilty of is having an unjustified belief as a result of an invalid inference. That is to say, they might be epistemically liable, but not morally. Well, this, I think, is a much more trenchant objection. However, I believe that even if racism is a logical mistake, we can hold most racists morally responsible for their egregious beliefs and actions. Long points out then the relationship between the logical and the ethical that dates back 2,500 years into the history of philosophy, uh, cites Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, um, cites Simon Blackburn and Thomas Nagel, and concludes that all persons have an ultimate responsibility in the moral realm, if not elsewhere. This requires carefully examining our ethical beliefs and practices, testing them through intuition and reason, and always being open to moral enlightenment. Uh, Long says, look, there could be a few people, describes maybe a child who is raised in a white supremacist compound, and uh, through the brainwashing doesn't see the error of their ways. But this describes a very, very small percentage of humanity. Long writes, the vast majority of human beings have the insights and reasoning to come to the truth that racism is wrong. Those who have this ability and fail to use it are morally accountable. Um, I still agree with this. I would say now that I believe that as human beings, simply in virtue of being human beings born into this shared world, we have some existential obligations. That is, we have duties that we must fulfill simply in virtue of being human beings. And one of these is to critically look at, at moral questions and ask what things are right and what things are wrong, and then to try to do those right things and try to avoid doing those wrong things. So Long is not going to let any racist off the hook who has that capacity. I think I'll stop here, but stay tuned for another video where I'll talk a little bit more about the naturalistic fallacy specifically.